Chapter 8. Ravenwood's Reckoning. The silence had barely settled before it shattered like thin ice. A door creaked open from the western corridor. Lilly pivoted, her dagger raised. Count Anatole Ravenko stepped into the mercury-slicked foyer, his once immaculate appearance now a mockery of its former precision. His silver-streaked hair hung loose around his shoulders, no longer constrained in its usual severe style. His waistcoat hung open, stained with substances Lilly couldn't identify, and his eyes, those calculating, cold eyes, now burned with an amber intensity that bordered on madness. "My dear Ravenwood," he said, his voice carrying the same aristocratic lilt that had once commanded her absolute obedience. "How disappointing to find you've brought animals to do your dirty work." The massive gauntlets encasing his hands and forearms drew Lilly's attention. They weren't like anything she'd seen him use before. Copper and iron fused in an unholy marriage, with valves that hissed steam at irregular intervals. Arcane symbols etched into the metal glowed with a sickly green luminescence, pulsing in time with what might have been Ravenko's heartbeat. "The wolves were merely the opening act," Lilly replied, circling to her right, keeping her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. The mercury parted around her boots, reflecting her movements in rippling silver. Ravenko's lips curled into something that might have been a smile on a human face. On his, it resembled nothing so much as a predator baring its teeth. "Such arrogance," he said, the gauntlets making a grinding mechanical sound as he flexed his fingers. "I crafted you from nothing. And this is how you repay your master," or... She ignored her emotions and their pull, focusing instead on the way Ravenko's right gauntlet began to glow brighter, the symbols shifting from green to a molten orange. "You never created me," she said, her voice steady, despite the rage coursing through her veins. "You only tried to cage what you couldn't understand." Ravenko's eyes narrowed, and the grinding sound from his gauntlets intensified. "Understanding was never the point, child. Control was. Control is." He raised his right arm with deliberate slowness, the gauntlet now pulsing with an inner fire that cast his face in demonic relief. The copper valves released a high-pitched whistle of escaping steam. "And control," he continued, "is what you lack." The gauntlet erupted with a sound like tearing metal. Shards of cursed shrapnel, each piece inscribed with miniature versions of the symbols adorning the gauntlet, exploded outward in a deadly constellation. Lilly dropped and rolled, the mercury splashing around her as the shrapnel embedded itself in the marble column behind where she'd stood. The stone hissed and blackened where the metal touched it, corruption spreading outward like ink in water. She came up in a crouch, blood already welling from a cut on her cheek where one shard had grazed her. The wound burned with unnatural heat, the flesh around it darkening with the same corruption that now marred the column. "New toys, Ravenko?" she asked, wiping the blood from her face with the back of her hand. The droplets fell to the mercury below, forming perfect crimson stars that floated on the liquid metal's surface. "I preferred your clockwork pets. At least they had personality." Ravenko's laugh echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing off broken marble and twisted metal. "Oh, my dear," he said, the left gauntlet now beginning its own mechanical symphony of grinding gears and hissing valves. "We've only just begun to play." The left gauntlet's gears whirred to life, a mechanical symphony of malice. Lilly's eyes narrowed, calculating trajectories as Ravenko's arm rose with theatrical slowness. The copper valves hissed, releasing steam that curled around his face like the breath of some infernal beast. "Your mother had such potential," Ravenko said, his aristocratic accent lilting through the ruined foyer. "But she lacked commitment." The gauntlet's arcane symbols shifted from green to yellow. Lilly's hand moved to her athame dagger, its familiar weight an extension of her will. In one fluid motion, she drew the blade across her palm, deep enough to part skin and muscle, but not sever tendon. Blood welled, crimson and vital, catching the fractured moonlight that spilled through the broken windows. The pain was nothing. A whisper compared to the roar of power that surged through her veins. "Let me show you commitment," Lilly said. The blood didn't fall. Instead, it crystallized, hardening into perfect stars that orbited her wrist like a constellation born of flesh rather than cosmic dust. They multiplied, dozens becoming hundreds, their edges razor-sharp and glinting with an inner light that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Ravenko's gauntlet discharged with a sound like tearing silk. The cursed shrapnel exploded outward, each piece a promise of corruption and slow death. Lilly thrust her hand forward. The blood stars responded, swirling before her in a shield of crimson geometry. The shrapnel met her defense with a sound like rain on hot metal. Where the two forces touched, Ravenko's projectiles blackened, then crumbled to rust that drifted to the mercury-slick floor. "Impressive," Ravenko said, lowering his arm. The spent gauntlet vented steam from its valves, cooling after its exertion. So, the daughter surpasses the mother at last. She could never fully manifest the star blood. The stars continued their dance around Lily's form, casting her shadow in multiples across the walls. The air between them crackled with ozone, sharp and electric. "My mother taught me more than you know," Lilly replied, her voice steady despite the rage coursing beneath her skin. Ravenko's eyes gleamed with something between pride and hatred. "Did she teach you to face your past, I wonder?" He raised both gauntlets now, their symbols shifting to a deep purple. The air between them shimmered, reality folding like paper in invisible hands. The foyer's broken marble and twisted metal melted away, replaced by walls of faded crimson wallpaper. The scent of cheap perfume and cheaper wine filled Lily's nostrils, so sudden and complete that her stomach lurched. Madame Lefebvre's brothel materialized around them, perfect in every nauseating detail. The creaking floorboards beneath her feet, the distant sound of a piano playing a tune she'd tried for decades to forget. Even the particular quality of light that filtered through the gauzy curtains. The same light that had fallen across de Montfort's face as she'd watched him die. "Poor little sparrow," came Ravenko's voice, though his lips didn't move. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Still haunted by the cage that shaped you." A figure appeared at the top of the familiar staircase. Madame Lefebvre herself, cane in hand, face twisted in that perpetual expression of contempt. Behind her, shadows moved in doorways, clients and girls alike, faceless but somehow still leering. Lily's blood stars faltered for a heartbeat, their orbit around her wrist stuttering. Then she laughed, the sound cutting through the illusion like her dagger through flesh. "Old ghosts don't bite, Boyar," she said, using the ancient Russian title as mockery. Her stars spun faster, their light intensifying until they blazed like miniature suns. "And memories make poor weapons against those who've survived them." The blood stars shot outward in a spiraling pattern, slicing through the phantom brothel. Where they passed, the illusion tore like rotten fabric, revealing the true ruined foyer beneath. The smell of ozone overwhelmed the phantom sense of the brothel, reality reasserting itself with each pass of her crimson constellation. The illusion shattered like stained glass, fragments of the phantom brothel dissolving into motes of light that winked out against the true reality of the ruined foyer. Lily's blood stars spun faster, their crimson light casting her shadow in multiples across the mercury-slick floor and broken marble. "Your parlor tricks grow tiresome, Boyar," she said, her voice steady despite the rage coursing beneath her skin. The constellation orbiting her wrist pulsed with her heartbeat, each star a perfect crystalline manifestation of her will. She narrowed her eyes, focusing on the dozens of blood stars until they began to spiral inward, drawing closer to one another. The air between them crackled with ozone, sharp and electric. Ravenko's eyes widened, aristocratic features twisting with something between fascination and fear. "What are you doing?" The stars compressed further, their individual forms merging, collapsing into a single point of brilliant, white-hot light that hovered above her palm. It burned with the intensity of a newborn sun, casting Ravenko's face in stark relief, all hollow cheeks and shadow-carved eyes. "Impossible," he whispered, raising his gauntlets defensively. "The power should have killed you years ago." "It tried," Lilly said, her lips curving into a smile that never reached her eyes. "But I'm remarkably difficult to kill." She thrust her palm forward. The compressed star shot across the space between them, trailing a comet's tail of crimson light. It struck Ravenko's left gauntlet with a sound like a cathedral bell being struck. The copper and iron contraption glowed cherry red, then white, the arcane symbols melting and running like wax down his arm. Ravenko's scream echoed through the ruined foyer, primal and raw. The smell of scorched metal and burning flesh filled the air as he tore the liquefying gauntlet from his arm, revealing blistered skin beneath. He lunged at her, his remaining gauntlet raised, its symbols pulsing with sickly yellow light. Lilly pivoted, her body moving with the fluid grace of a dancer, the motion so practiced it required no conscious thought. His bulk passed her by mere inches, close enough that she could smell the pomade in his hair. Her fingers dipped into his coat pocket as he stumbled past, finding and extracting the silver stylus, the very instrument he had used to brand her cheek all those years ago. Its weight settled in her palm, cool and slender. Ravenko whirled, his face contorted with rage, but Lilly was already moving. She slashed her palm with her enchanted Atami dagger, fresh blood welling to coat the stylus. The metal absorbed her blood, beginning to glow with the same white-hot intensity as her compressed star. "You dare!" Ravenko began, but his words died as Lilly drove the superheated stylus into his throat. The metal parted flesh with sickening ease, sliding through skin and muscle with no more resistance than a hot knife through butter. Steam hissed from the wound, blood boiling on contact with the star-heated metal. Ravenko's eyes bulged, his remaining gauntlet clawing at the air between them. The symbols on its surface flickered, then faded as his life force ebbed. Lilly leaned close, her face inches from his, watching the light dim in his eyes. The stylus in her hand, the instrument of her branding, her years of servitude, now became the instrument of his demise. The poetic justice of it filled her with a cold, crystalline satisfaction that settled in her chest like a shard of ice. "This is for the girl in Marseille," she whispered, twisting the stylus deeper. "And for all the others who weren't so difficult to kill." Silver light poured from Ravenko's throat wound, illuminating his face from within like a grotesque lantern. His eyes widened, not with fear, but with something akin to reverence as he stared at Lilly. "You vulgar marvel," he gurgled, mercury-tinged blood bubbling between his lips. The stylus in Lilly's hand grew cold, the heat of her rage dissipating as she watched her tormentor's dissolution begin. Cracks appeared across Ravenko's aristocratic features, fine lines at first, like porcelain stressed by sudden heat. They spread with alarming speed, a web of fractures mapping his face, his neck, his hands. Light seeped through each new fissure, casting prismatic patterns across the ruined marble floor. Lilly stepped back, her blood stars still orbiting her wrist but dimmer now, their purpose fulfilled. The air in the foyer grew thick with the scent of ozone and hot metal, the same smell that lingered after lightning struck too close. Ravenko's body convulsed, his spine arching unnaturally. The cracks widened, mercury seeping through like quicksilver tears. His skin took on the appearance of a shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting Lilly's face back at her. Dozens of Lillys watching with cold satisfaction as the Count's form began to collapse inward. "Is this what you imagined, Boya?" she asked, her voice steady despite the spectacle before her. "Your grand finale?" Ravenko couldn't answer. His jaw worked silently as more cracks spread across his throat. The gauntlet on his remaining hand sparked once, twice, then went dark as the arcane symbols faded to nothing. With a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake, Ravenko's chest caved in. Mercury poured from the cavity, pooling around his feet in an expanding silver puddle. His limbs followed, dissolving into the metallic substance that had powered so many of his creations. The splash of his transmuting flesh echoed in the cavernous space, a perverse baptism in reverse. From the mercury rose dozens of tiny clockwork mechanisms, gears, springs, and delicate brass frameworks no larger than a child's finger. They hovered above the silver pool, spinning and clicking, each one emitting a high, keening sound that pierced Lily's ears. Souls, she realized. The clockwork souls of those Ravenko had consumed to fuel his magic. They spiraled upward, their brass and copper components catching the light of her fading blood stars. The wailing intensified, a chorus of mechanical grief and liberation that made the remaining windows in the foyer vibrate in their frames. Lily watched them rise, a strange emptiness hollowing out her chest where triumph should have bloomed. Years of planning, of pain, of careful manipulation, all culminating in this moment of mercury and brass. It was over. The collar around her neck would never burn again. The brand would never pulse with his will. The clockwork souls reached the domed ceiling, their keening shifting to something almost musical. One by one, they winked out, like stars at dawn, leaving only the faintest shimmer of brass dust floating in the air. The pool of mercury that had been Count Anatole Ravenko gave one final corrosive sigh. Steam rose from its surface, carrying the scent of alchemy and decay. Then it stilled, a perfect mirror reflecting the ruined grandeur of the foyer, and Lily's solitary figure standing at its edge. She knelt, careful not to touch the mercury, and studied her reflection in its surface. The woman who stared back was both familiar and strange, her features harder, her eyes colder than she remembered. This was the face of someone who had survived, who had won. The stylus in her hand seemed suddenly heavy, its purpose fulfilled. She considered dropping it into the mercury, letting it dissolve alongside its former master. Instead, she slipped it into her pocket. A reminder, perhaps, or insurance. The blood stars orbiting her wrist had faded to dull crimson points, barely brighter than embers. One by one, they winked out, their light absorbed back into her skin, leaving only the faintest constellation of scars across her palm. The flat in Spitalfields greeted dawn with reluctance hours later, its grimy windows filtering the first grey light through layers of London soot. Lily sat cross-legged on her mother's carpet, its once vibrant patterns now muted by time and the faint rust-coloured acid stains that no amount of scrubbing would remove. The carpet remained her one concession to sentiment, a fragment of memory salvaged from a life that seemed to belong to someone else. A teacup rested at the carpet's edge, its contents long gone cold. The scent of jasmine had faded, replaced by the musty perfume of old plaster and damp that permeated every corner of London's cheaper dwellings. Lily's breathing slowed, each exhale measured and deliberate. Her tattoos pulsed with a gentle amber glow, no longer the searing anger induced by Ravenko's control, but channels for something that had always been hers. She extended her palm upward, a canvas awaiting its paint. "Blood stars," she murmured, her voice barely disturbing the pre-dawn stillness. The small cut on her palm wept crimson, but instead of falling, the droplets hovered, suspended by will rather than physics. They trembled, then separated into perfect crimson spheres that caught the weak light and transformed it into something richer, deeper. The tiny stars orbited her wrist, their movement synchronized with her heartbeat. Her mother's voice drifted through memory, clear as if she stood in the room. "Never reach for them when you're angry, Lily. They will remember and have great potential for harm." The blood stars pulsed, responding to the thought of her mother. Lily closed her eyes, focusing on the sensation of power flowing through her veins, no longer fighting against Ravenko's constraints, but moving with natural grace through pathways that had always existed within her. When she opened her eyes again, the stars had multiplied. Dozens of tiny crimson points now hovered before her, awaiting direction. Lily exhaled slowly, imagining the form she wished them to take. The stars shifted, rearranging themselves with fluid precision. Wings formed first, then a sleek body, finally a sharp beak, a raven silhouette crafted of blood and will, suspended in the air before her. The bird rotated slowly, its outline perfect down to the individual feathers. Unlike Ravenko's mechanical monstrosities, this creation held a natural grace, an extension of Lily herself rather than something forced into unnatural service. The tattoos across her skin hummed in harmony with the blood construct. What had once been chains were now conduits, pathways for magic that had always been her birthright. The raven's wings beat once, twice, a silent flight through the stale air of the flat. Lily felt each movement as if it were her own body stretching, testing boundaries that had once seemed immutable. For the first time since she could remember, Lily felt peace settle into her bones. Not the false calm of submission or the temporary respite of revenge, but something deeper, the quiet certainty of coming into her own power on her own terms. The blood raven dissolved, its component stars returning to orbit around her wrist like faithful companions. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, 3 precise taps followed by silence. Not the erratic pounding of the Crimson Fleet's thugs, nor the mechanical rhythm of Ravenko's sentries. This visitor knew the value of restraint. Lily's blood stars materialized around her wrist without conscious thought, crimson spheres orbiting like tiny planets. She moved to the door with predatory grace, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. "Westwood," she said, not a question but an acknowledgement as she opened the door. Jackson Westwood stood in the dim hallway, his spectacles catching what little light filtered through the grimy window at the end of the corridor. His shoulders were dusted with London's perpetual grime, and his fingers clutched something wrapped in oilcloth with the reverence one might afford a holy relic. "Miss Ravenwood?" His voice carried the precise diction of a scholar, though fatigue had roughened its edges. "May I come in?" Lily stepped aside, her blood stars still circling her wrist like faithful companions. Westwood's gaze flickered to them, a mixture of academic fascination and primal wariness crossing his features. "You've been busy," she observed, noting the fresh cut above his eyebrow and the singed edges of his coat sleeve. "As have you." He gestured to the room in chaos after the attacking warlocks. "I see you. Must have had company." Lily dismissed the stars with a flick of her wrist, the droplets returning to her bloodstream with a sensation like ice melting against warm skin. "What brings you to my door at this ungodly hour, Westwood?" He unwrapped the oilcloth with deliberate movements, revealing a book bound in leather, so ancient it had darkened to the color of dried blood. Symbols were burned into its cover, patterns that made Lily's tattoos pulse in recognition. "I found this in Ravenko's private collection, at the British Museum," Westwood said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Your mother's grimoire. It contains everything about the star blood of the Blackwood lineage." Lily's breath caught in her throat. Her fingers hovered over the book, not quite touching it, as if it might dissolve into smoke at her touch. The leather seemed to breathe beneath her hand, warm and alive despite its age. "How did you—" she began, but Westwood shook his head. "Some questions are better left unasked," he said, placing the grimoire in her hands. "Especially when the answers might involve breaking into a dead man's vault while his former associates are still sorting through the remains of his empire." The weight of the book settled into Lily's palms, heavier than its physical mass suggested. This was her heritage, her birthright. Pages filled with her mother's knowledge, preserved despite Ravenko's best efforts to erase all traces of the woman who had defied him. A howl pierced the pre-dawn stillness, rising from the street below. Not the cry of a stray dog, or the wail of a drunken reveler, but something primal and purposeful. Lily moved to the window, the grimoire still clutched to her chest. Gabriel's silhouette stood stark against the grey light of approaching dawn, his massive frame unmistakable even in human form. The alpha of the Crimson Paw Pack lifted his face to her window, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than challenge. 2 more wolves flanked him, their forms melting between shadow and substance. "The wolves are marking territory," Westwood observed, keeping a cautious distance from the window. "London's underworld is reshuffling in Ravenko's absence." "New alliances will be necessary," Lilly said, her gaze still fixed on Gabriel's imposing figure. "Maybe we find ourselves working together again." Westwood's reflection appeared beside hers in the grimy glass. "The Grimoire contains rituals that could amplify your abilities tenfold. Your mother was formidable." Lily's fingers tightened on the book. "And you expect payment for this gift?" "Consider it an investment in our continued association," Westwood replied, adjusting his spectacles. "Knowledge shared is power multiplied." Another howl rose from the street, answered by distant cries from across the city. Gabriel turned away, his pack melting into the shadows of Spittlefield's narrow streets. Lily moved to her small table where a crystal decanter caught the first grey light of morning. She removed the wolfsbane sprig from her pocket, the one left in Ravenko's mercury remains, and dropped it into the clear liquid. The flower twisted as it sank, releasing tendrils of purple that spiraled through the water like smoke. "Until next time, Miss Ravenwood," Westwood said, already moving toward the door. "Westwood, you know some of my secrets. They are mine to guard, not yours to share with anyone. Do so at your peril," she stated as cold facts. Lily didn't watch him leave. Her attention had returned to the grimoire, its cover warm beneath her fingertips. She traced the symbols burned into the leather, feeling them respond to her touch like living things. The door closed with a soft click as Westwood departed. Outside, the wolves' howls faded into the awakening city's rumble. Lily opened the grimoire to its first yellowed page, where her mother's handwriting flowed across the paper in elegant, determined strokes. "To my daughter, Liliana, blood of my blood, star of my heart, may these words light your path when I no longer can." "Blood of my blood," she whispered, echoing the dedication on the first page. With a practiced motion, Lily drew her athame across her palm. Blood welled, dark and potent, then separated into perfect crimson spheres that rose from her skin. The droplets hovered, suspended in the air around her, each one catching the dim light and magnifying it until the room glowed with a constellation of her making. "There you are," Lily murmured, satisfaction warming her voice. Each second matched the pulse of her hovering stars, a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with something deeper, the very magic flowing through her veins. "You've got cold eyes, little Lilly Ravenwood." The troll Grudach had told her once, his Highland brogue thick with something between concern and admiration. "Calculating eyes, like you're always counting the cost of things." The memory of the troll's words brought a smile to her lips. He'd seen something in her even then, something beyond Ravenko's making, something older, wilder, more powerful. The Thames would be exhaling its morning breath now, and somewhere beneath Blackfriars Bridge, Grudach would be carving his driftwood, perhaps lifting his amber eyes to the breaking dawn and catching her scent on the wind. Not just the girl he'd known, but the woman she'd become. The power she'd reclaimed. Lily turned another yellowed page, her blood stars shifting to illuminate new secrets. The grimoire detailed rituals and spells her mother had mastered, knowledge passed down through generations of her heritage and of the Blackwoods, with star blood in their veins. Knowledge that was her birthright. The weight of it settled on her shoulders. Not a burden, but a mantle. Daunting, yet exhilarating. She was the inheritor of a lineage older than Ravenko could have imagined, more powerful than he had ever understood. And she would learn it all, revitalize it. Her fingers brushed against the raven-shaped scar on her cheek, the brand Ravenko had given her as a mark of ownership. It no longer burned with his control. Now it pulsed with her own power, transformed from a symbol of servitude into something else entirely. A sigil of her reclaimed identity. Lilly Ravenwood turned another page, ready to write her own story in blood and starlight.